Hello everyone, welcome to Pete's CD Vinyl World. Today I just want to do a video that I came up with an idea to do a topic of bands that were sort of lost in limbo. And by that I mean bands that, primarily hard rock metal bands that actually didn't fit into a subcategory of metal or fit into multiple ones, and in the long run sort of hurt their career for it. And all of these bands that I'm going to talk about are ones that emerged in the 80s, where sort of the subclassifications of metal started to appear. Thrash, hard rock, hair metal, blah, blah, blah. Back in the 70s, it was all just called hard rock. The term heavy metal itself back in the 70s, a lot of times if I read an older magazine, they include like Styx and Meatloaf even into that category as well. So anything with sort of like a harder edge was called heavy metal. By the late 70s, early 80s, that sort of became more defined with Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, etc. With the introduction of thrash and eventually hair metal or glam metal, there's sort of all these subgenres of metal started to emerge, even sort of like sleaze rock or sleaze metal with Guns N' Roses, Faster Pussycat, etc. So by that time, the mid to late 80s, if you didn't fit into one of these categories, not only did most fans not know what to think of you, but I don't think the record companies or MTV even knew what to do with you. And some of these bands did have some success for a short while, but just never either had a long-term success or are even today able to capitalize on their limited success and be one of those classic bands who's able to tour either theaters or most of these bands that are around today are still just playing clubs where they should be on package tours or I think you'll see what I mean when I talk about the bands. And there's some bands that got away from this and were able to have a long-term success. One of them being, say, Cheap Trick. They weren't, you couldn't easily classify them. Were they power pop, hard rock, new wave, pop, punkish in a way? They were all of those things and sort of none of those things at the same time, but they were able to sort of capitalize on that. But again, they didn't have long-term success as far as like platinum albums and singles. They were able to, develop a long career from that. Another band too might be Rush. Were they prog? Were they hard rock? Were they metal? Were they classic rock? They're sort of all of those things, but you can't really put them in one category. So they were able to somehow create their own fan base and were able to capitalize on that success and continue for their whole career. So these bands seem to escape that. So I got 5 I'm going to talk about. I got one honorable mention, which may or not fit into this category. So the honorable mention I'm going to go with is Wasp. Their first album came out in like 82, 83. So they had a big sort of stage show based on like a horror gore theme, a la Alice Cooper times 10. Their music, you could say, was just pretty much straight ahead metal. And for a couple years that was okay, but by the late 80s, unless they weren't thrash, they weren't hair metal, so they sort of fell by the wayside in that sense. If you looked at them, they looked more in line with, say, a Judas Priest style band or something like that, but they just never had the wide success they should have. And they had, pretty good success early on. To me, they should have been on the same level as, say, Dio. He was selling out arenas, had platinum albums during the 80s. They should have been on that same level, in my opinion. But, again, they've had a sort of a loyal, smaller fan base, but just, again, you never hear of them being taken out on these nostalgia tours, bands from the 80s or things like that, because they don't fit into the hairband packages. They don't fit into the thrash packages. So it's too bad that Dio passed away, because like a Dio Wasp double headlining tour would be great nowadays. All right, so going to talk about my top 5 now. And it's just the first 5 bands I thought of in this category. So, first band I'm going to talk about is Stryper. So, they had pretty good success with, I would say, 3 of their albums. Soldiers Under Command, To Hell with the Devil, and then In God We Trust. They believe all of those went gold or platinum. They were sort of an MTV band. What they would do is sort of release all of their ballads or lighter songs as singles and ballads, and they sort of got, and by their image with the hair and everything, they were lumped into the hair metal crowd, or hair metal bands. But really, the majority of their music is actually closer to like Judas Priest than, say, Poison or Warrant. And I don't think they get enough credit for being a much heavier band. And Stryper's one of those bands I would just call straight ahead metal. They're not thrash, they're not glam or hair metal, they're just metal. And Michael Sweet and Oz Fox, they don't get the recognition as one of those great guitar duos, just like Glenn Tipton and KK Downing, or Adrian Smith and Dave Murray from Iron Maiden. If you listen to their solos, I mean, they had some of the best solos in the 80s. And Michael Sweet has one of the best voices, and he still does. So that's one band right there where, when it came to the 90s, number one, they were sort of forgotten about because they didn't really do a reunion, I believe, till the early 2000s. And 2 is they didn't really fit on those package tours that started coming, or those hair metal cruises. Bands like, say, Doc and Warrant, Poison, when they were all touring together in the early 2000s, they couldn't fit on any of those bills. And obviously they couldn't fit on a bill with, say, I say 15 years ago, I know Judas Priest toured with Queensryche. I saw them. So they wouldn't really fit on a bill like that either. Definitely wouldn't fit on a thrash bill. So, again, a band that sort of, to this day, is lost in limbo. They're still playing clubs where they should, to me, be playing, if theaters or sheds in a package tour somewhere. Next up, I'm going to go with Living Colour. So if you remember Living Colour, they were sort of this New York hard rock / funk band, even / alternative, you could say, that came out in the late 90s. What did they come out? 89? 88, their first album came out. So they were one of those bands, kind of like Faith No More, that were played on Headbangers Ball, and they were played on 120 Minutes on MTV, which was their sort of alternative show they would have weekly. This is before alternative got big. This is sort of late 80s into the early 90s. So we're all black hard rock band, which is an unusual thing. But they also had funk elements, like I said, alternative. Their first album was a huge success. Of course, everybody knows the song Cult of Personality. They had several other hits on here. Their second one wasn't as successful, had a couple of MTV songs. It's not as accessible as the first one. Definitely not as easy as a listen. Not sure if that had anything to do with them sort of dropping off. Their third album came out in 93, Steen. And to me, this was a great album. And even this had some rock radio airplay with Leave It Alone and a couple others. But what sort of happened to them is, I think people had the attitude of, oh, Living Colour, they're just an 80s band, right? And even though they did play some Lollapaloozas, they should have rode that wave of alternative music in the early to mid 90s and became even bigger. That's my opinion, but I think people toss them off as sort of just this 80s band, and it's unfortunate because even to this day, I know they tour every so often, but they're not, again, they can't fit on a package that has multiple bands from a specific genre because they don't fit into anything. They would possibly fit in a bill with a band like Fishbone or something like that, but even that, they're not even that big of a band where they would play anything beyond the club either. So kind of unfortunate what happened to them. I feel if their first album came out in like 91, 92, they would have been one of the biggest bands of the 90s. It's just unfortunate they sort of ahead of their time. Next band I want to talk about, how about some Armored Saint? Sort of, I would say overall forgotten about, even in the hard rock metal community. They didn't have a whole lot of albums out in their first decade. I think about 4 or 5. They sort of emerged as, all like leather medieval outfits. Their music, to me, was straight ahead metal, I would say, but it just touched thrash a little bit. When people talk about the big 4 in thrash, Anthrax, Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, a lot of people always say, "Oh, what would be your 5th member of the big 5, say, of thrash?" And everyone almost says Testament or Exodus. To me, I would say Armored Saint. Even though they're not really thrash, they've always, to me, fit into that group more than any other category. To me, they were sort of like the American version of Judas Priest, if you want to look at them that way. Again, by the late 80s, they couldn't really fit into a category. They weren't thrash. They weren't hair metal, obviously. The only bands that were straight ahead metal that could go ahead and use that as their sort of genre was Priest and Maiden at that point. And they were already, 10, 15 years into the game. So it's unfortunate, even to this day. I know Armored Saint still does reunions and plays here and there, but they just play clubs. You would think they would be added onto some sort of tour. How about, Queensryche, Priest, and Armored Saint? That would be a great tour. Or Maiden and Armored Saint. But even they had one. The Symbol of Salvation, to me, is one of the best metal albums of the 90s. I think that came out in 91 or 92. It was on MTV a little bit, but, of course, they didn't fit into a genre. So unfortunately, they sort of fell by the wayside. Next band, I'm going to go with Y&T. And Y&T's got a sort of a long history. They actually emerged in the late 70s. Their first 2 albums, they were actually called Yesterday and Today. By the early 80s, they changed to Y&T. And, for some reason, it's hard to believe that Y&T never had a gold album. And it's not for any lack of MTV support. I would say from 84 through 86, all of their videos were on MTV all the time. The song Summertime Girls, I'm sure you've heard it on classic rock radio. They even play it to this day. It was a pretty big hit, and every summer MTV would play it all the time. But somehow this band never got to gold status. And it's really unfortunate. Part of it is, like I'm saying with the previous bands, they were just straight ahead hard rock / metal. In the later 80s, they put out an album called Contagious that was leaning more towards the Bon Jovi big hair sound with the big background vocals. They were going for that then, but I think people perceive them as an old band trying to do that. So again, they didn't get the success they deserved. And it's unfortunate because Dave Meniketti is one of the best vocalists and guitar players in the hard rock metal genre, but he just doesn't get the credit they deserve. So again, to this day, I don't understand why they're not included on some of these package tours. Obviously, nobody toured last year, but I'm saying even in the past 10, 15 years, they're always just playing on their own in clubs. Still a big San Francisco band regionally, I believe. But it's unfortunate they never had the success because they couldn't be categorized as a specific type of metal. And I think the number one band that fits in this category, which everyone would probably agree would be King's X. Another unfortunate case, sort of like Living Colour, where they had a little bit of success in the beginning. And they were a hard rock / Beatlesque band that had a lot of harmonies, sort of weird instrumentation, weird arrangements, that sort of thing. They had a black singer also. But it's not for lack of MTV support, because their first few albums, their videos were all over MTV. So I don't think they were given a fair chance. It's just that the public, I don't think, grasped onto their music like most musicians have. And again, it's unfortunate if this band had emerged, say, in 1991 or 92 instead of, I believe, 88 is the first one. Yeah, 88. They're a little, 3 or 4 years ahead of their time. So by the time they got to the 90s, this is their 5th album called Dogman. And it came out in 94, and it sort of has a grungier, detuned sound than their previous ones. And it's funny because King's X were detuning their guitars way before the grunge movement. So a lot of grunge bands were influenced by King's X. But yeah, this had a lot of radio airplay too, but they just never could cross the line into the next level of stardom. And again, they don't really play anything other than Gloves. They're never on package tours. I saw them actually, I've only seen them one time, and this was in the early 2000s. They opened up for Joe Satriani and Dream Theater in a outdoor shed type stadium. That's the only time I recall them being put on a package tour. And it's unfortunate because they're a great band vocally and musically, and it's the one band that most musicians say should have been bigger, when they said that. Anyway, that's my choices for that topic. If you have any, let me know in the comments. If you like these videos, please subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.